Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. Dumpling, are you there on hand?
Yes, I'm right here. Been here spiritually since 24 hours ago. Been waiting for this space.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, this is exciting, isn't it? I'm really looking forward to speaking to Charles. I think this is going to be a great conversation. I've got to be honest with you. I have got so many questions that I want to ask him. I've no idea whether we're going to have the time to get through even a fraction of them. But hey, let's see.
Yeah, is this the first time you're doing a one-on-one with Charles, Guy?
It is, yeah. It is. Yeah, I've obviously been following him for a long time. I've watched a ton of his videos on his YouTube channel and elsewhere, and been following his work for many years now. So this is going to be really exciting, I think. And I should say, thank you everyone for joining. It seems like there's a lot of people very excited to have a listen to this conversation with Charles. So I hope we can live up to expectations. As I say, I've got so many things I want to ask him. Dumpling, my co-host here, is going to has got a few questions for him as well. And if you guys have questions, please do put them in the comments. We will try and ask a few of them if we can. A lot of it depends on time and how talkative Charles is, etc., etc. But we will try and get some of your questions in as well.
Well, Charles is always talkative, so we got to be strategic about it, don't we?
We have. Maybe we'll have to sort of move him on if he gets too deep into the weeds in some aspects. But we'll do what we can, because he's the sort of guy, I think, you just want to listen to him talk. Really, he's got so much to say. He's such a smart guy. He's sort of done so much within crypto and beyond. You kind of feel he could go on for hours.
Yeah. So talking to Charles is like what I would say eating a very big salad. He can talk about so many different topics. So one interview feels like you've taken different lectures from different fields. So Guy, what are you most looking forward to learning from today's space with a chat with Charles then?
Well, I'm really excited just to hear from him sort of where Cardano is at the moment in terms of some of their kind of recent updates. I'm fascinated to talk to him about governance as well. I know this was something that we sort of talked about beforehand, you and I know you've got some questions about that. I'm really interested to hear what he's going to say on that. I'm really interested also just to kind of hear his take on the industry itself. Where we are at the moment. It's been safe to say a kind of interesting year. So I think it would be fascinating to hear what he has to say about that. The opinion of someone sort of really embedded in the industry, if you like. And I'll be honest with you, I've got questions about aliens and Bison as well. So there's a lot to cover.
Excellent. We do have some requests about aliens, so that's great. And do you mind sending Charles the speaker invite? I think we're just about on time.
Yep, I've sent that to him, so he should have that, and all well, he should be with us in a moment or so. But yes, Dumpling, you spoke to Charles. You interviewed him in Colorado just last week, wasn't it, at the Rare Evo conference?
Yeah, absolutely. It was supposed to be a 15-minute slot. It was a great conversation, so we talked for almost an hour. Very interesting conversation. He had very different views on governance, shall we say, from I think many other major blockchains. That's something we can dive into today. Many are going to be slightly surprised about his take, so I'm looking forward to that. And Charles, welcome to the space. Really glad you're joining us. Guy and we have been so excited for the space. Welcome, Charles. And everyone, please retweet the space so more people can join.
Now, Charles should have. I have sent Charles the speaker invite. I'll send it again just in case he didn't get it. So Charles should be able to join as a speaker now, with a bit of luck. In the meantime, whilst we're waiting for Charles to join as a speaker, I'd like to welcome everyone to this is our third Coin Bureau space. This is our new live discussion series where we explore sort of major topics and trends across crypto and blockchain and beyond. And our goal with this is to host, these regular live discussions, diving into the big picture crypto landscape, all sorts of topics to cover. And we've already talked about regulations a couple of weeks ago. We talked about CBDCs last week. And this week we have something a little bit different for you, because we have a one-on-one, if you like, with Cardano's Charles Hoskinson, who should hopefully have my speaker invite now. I've just resent that. So with a bit of luck, Charles should have that in a sec. And yeah, I mean, Charles doesn't really need much of an introduction, but for anyone unfamiliar, he is one of the co-founders of Ethereum, but best known as the founder of Cardano. He's dedicated much of his life to shaping the trajectory of blockchain technology. He leads now one of the largest crypto projects and communities. And he also advocates for the industry in congressional hearings. He's active in lots of other ventures as well, including among many other things, the search for extraterrestrial life. And today he's joining us to share his insights on some of those things that we talked about earlier. But I am still trying to get him on as a speaker, so he should. Charles.
I send a request, you could just accept it. I don't have to rejoin the link, man.
Oh, sorry, that's me, Charles. I'm pretty cat-handed when it comes to technology, so apologies. How are you doing? Thank you for joining us.
Very, very good. It's good to finally be here. Good to finally be on Coin Bureau at time.
It has, and we've been covering Cardano. We've been talking about your work in the space for a long, long time. So this is a fantastic opportunity to talk to you one-on-one. I'm really looking forward to it. Can I ask, Charles, are you in Colorado, and is it warm and is it sunny?
It's always warm and always sunny here, and thanks for not mentioning the jet. I appreciate it.
Charles, we can always get to the jet if you want to. No, well, actually, before we kind of dive into talking about Cardano and all the other things I wanted to talk about, I've got a slightly personal question for you, Charles, if you don't mind. Now, you are clearly a very busy man. There's so much going on in your professional life. So I wanted to start by asking you, what on earth made you take the time to go searching for evidence of alien life recently? And is that your idea of a holiday?
Well, I've always had a soft spot for people that challenge the orthodoxy of an academic discipline or, some form of social institution. So, for example, in mathematics, I was always a big fan of the automath movement and the QED manifesto. And most mathematicians, they don't give a shit at all about formalizing math in a way that machines can understand. But I said, well, that's necessary because we need to be able to debug our proofs, and they're getting too big and complicated, and peer review is getting too long. So I put a bunch of money and created the Hoskinson Center for Formal Mathematics to create a permanent institution at CMU specifically to invest in formal mathematics that machines can understand. And now everybody cares about it because large language models are getting involved in math, and this is kind of the approach. Well, analogously, when you look at astronomy, there's a lot of people that go into astrophysics and astronomy who are deeply interested in the search for extraterrestrial life, but you're not allowed in that academic discipline to mention that. So in anything, they will bend over backwards to try to find a way to not say aliens. For example, with Oumuamua, it could slow down, and they're going to comport themselves and say, well, maybe there's like trapped gas, and as it gets closer to the sun, it melts, and the gas comes out, and that's why there's propulsion or something like that. Or, the alternative explanation is it's artificial. But no, we can't say that. So with Avi, he was one of the few astrophysicists who had enough credibility because, he's a big guy at Harvard and H-index of 130. He's a real guy who's out there willing to take the hits. And I figured if we could get some of his ideas over the fence and actually get them through the rigors of peer review, then it would open up the entire academic discipline for a much more reasonable conversation where you're allowed now in your paper to suggest an artificial origin, as opposed to saying everything is just natural and there are no aliens, even though the universe is so big. So this was a very small entry point, and it was a lot of fun to go to Papua New Guinea, and we were about 60 miles off the coast of Manus Island. Netflix came with us, and they did a documentary. Jason Cohn is directing it. They're going to do a 90-minute feature, and I think over 50 million people they estimate are going to watch that. So it's just a really good way of amplifying that, showing how good science is done under the hood, how the peer review process works under the hood, and also sometimes how personal biases of scientists can get in the way of good science. We only tend to see it when people are criticizing outliers, but sometimes institutions as a whole can have a group think. And I felt that was a very important analogy to what we ran into in the cryptocurrency space. I remember having legendary fights with Paul Krugman and other economists who basically said not only crypto is a scam, but it can't work by the laws of economics because a deflationary spiral killed Bitcoin. I mean, he was saying this in 2011. And we were fighting him, and he's got the Nobel Prize, and we're just a bunch of ragtags in the middle of nowhere. So I felt a similar kinship in that regard, and it was just a lot of fun to go and participate and add some rigor to it, and make sure that it got the resources it needed. And anytime I see an academic discipline where these things are kind of the underdogs, it's the same medicine with like PEMF, pulse electromagnetic fields, and photobiomodulation. Just now we're starting to acknowledge the medical benefits. Well, people have been talking about those medical benefits in some cases for over a century. But it's under research because the problem is that you're not allowed to use these words. NIH won't fund you, NSF won't fund you. So I feel a kinship, and I carry it in every discipline that I get involved in.
It sounds a little, Charles, like that kind of ties into how you might feel about how the crypto world sort of looks on you as Cardano's founder. Do you kind of have that sense of still being an outsider in this space?
It's kind of funny to be an outsider when you got millions of fans, and every place you go, you get a lot of love. There's two forms of tribalism. I mean, there's economic tribalism where people have a financial incentive to hate you, so they hate you because they're talking their book. I mean, that's kind of like the Pittsburgh Steelers versus the Philadelphia Eagles. I mean, you're a fan, you got a team, you support your thing, and you fight, for the thing you want. Or we, the Denver Broncos versus Kansas City. Those were a legendary rivalry. I remember watching those games, and at the end of the day, we're all football fans, and we all like the same thing. It's just we have our teams. Then there's criticism that comes from fair or unfair. It gets deeply personal, and they basically think they know exactly who I am, my personality, my motivations, what I am, and they take it to a point where they say I'm a sociopath or a pathological liar, or I'm an actual harmful person or dangerous. And what's extraordinary to me is the people who say that the loudest never seem to say that about SBF or about Do Kwon or any of these horrible things. They just kind of interviewed those people and said how handsome and beautiful and smart they are. For 10 years, they criticized me, but those people get a complete pass. I don't know what's in their heart, and I don't know why they do what they do, but it doesn't really keep me up at night very much. We just build. Cardano's a huge ecosystem. IOG does many things. I have 6 companies, everything from bison ranching to glow-in-the-dark plants. I was in a music video with Snoop Dogg. I found alien artifacts in the Pacific Ocean. So I think, despite the haters, my life is pretty fucking good right now.
Your life is pretty damn busy. It sounds like. I really want to ask you about the bison, but we'll get to that maybe a little later on. Before we talk about Cardano in particular, Charles, it's interesting that you talked about kind of sports teams there and people's affiliations to their teams. Does it ever surprise you how tribal this industry can be? How attached people get to particular projects? Cardano is a great example. Like, Cardano has one of the strongest, most vocal, most passionate, committed communities out there. I don't think anyone could really argue with that. But does it ever surprise you that people attach themselves to projects like Cardano and other crypto projects in that sort of way, in that kind of very tribal way?
No, not at all, because if they're not there for economic reasons, which many people are not there for economic reasons, they're there for philosophical reasons. And what we sell as an ecosystem is this idea that you get to run your own life. And in an age of vaccine mandates and travel restrictions, and every day you wake up, you get less freedom, and you get molested by the TSA every time you go and fly. Honestly, we're losing a lot of control of our life. You have government institutions that basically say that school systems don't even have to tell parents what they're doing to their children, and actually sue them when they try to tell them what they're doing to their children. It's pretty despicable. And so when people at crypto, they say, that's me getting my economic agency back. That's me getting self-sovereign identity. That's me getting control of my data and privacy. This is me getting control of my voice in voting. For example, half of America thinks the voting systems are broken and rigged. Well, I'd like to be able to verify and check my own vote. Why is that a controversial partisan statement? Shouldn't it be easy for me to just pull out my cell phone and verify that the system has integrity and my vote was counted correctly? Well, that's what blockchain sells at its core. And once you understand that, you demand it. You say, I want that in every aspect of life. I want inclusive accountability. I want the ability to keep the system honest. So they get fanatically loyal because they keep getting victimized in the other side of the system. There was a statistic I saw the other day, which is extraordinary to me. Last year, we had more money taken in civil asset forfeiture than we did in burglary and petty crimes, meaning the state stole more money from in the United States by seizing it, including lawfully derived money. You have to sue the government to get your money back. than burglars did when they broke into people's homes. So you can't tell me that that's an honest state and that everything's copacetic and everybody's happy, regardless where your politics fall. If you're in the BLM or Occupy Wall Street or the Tea Party, there's a ubiquitousness in America and the world as a whole that we're just not being treated fairly. So cryptocurrencies and blockchain are a political and philosophical movement that basically say we want a new social contract and we want a new way of taking care of our lives. And so that's why people get so attached to them, because they get reminded on a daily basis why these systems are necessary, especially when they're being victimized by the heavy hand of government.
Yeah, I guess in many ways, pretty much the only thing that many people can really agree on is that the current system that we have is broken. You know, trust in government is eroding. I think that's something that you can unite left and right, perhaps, if such a thing is possible. But well, I mean, that prompts me, because we wanted to talk about governance in this conversation. So, I mean, trust in government is eroding, as you point out. So, is that why Cardano is going to create its own governance system? Is that where
that's always been part of the roadmap? We said, you know, a third generation has three core properties, and almost all the third generation cryptocurrencies that are legitimate, like Polkadot, like Tezos, and others, are chasing that. And so scalability, interoperability, and sustainability being defined as governance, you need to do that. And governance is not, well, we give all the power to Bob over there and he's going to do a great job. Bob has like 12 PhDs. He's a wheelbarrow full of diplomas, to quote a person who shall remain nameless. You know, some guy like that. No, governance is by the people for the people. So everybody who has a stake in the system, whether they're building on it to hold the underlying currency or they're in some way philosophically aligned with it, there should be some combination of representation, institutionalization, and constitutional law that come together in just the right balance that give a reasonable sampling of those opinions and allow the system to be effective. And efficacy is defined in kind of two dimensions. One is that the goals that are chosen, it can actually achieve those goals and converge to deciding on them. And then the second thing is having the wisdom to understand which goals to pick and when to pick them. For example, we know quantum computers are coming, but you're actually putting yourself at a huge competitive disadvantage by embracing post-quantum algorithms right now. A, because they're very inefficient and there's nothing to optimize them. So you're going to make your system 10 times more slow than it sits with elliptic curve crypto. B, nothing has been fully standardized. And so if you pick the wrong algorithms, then what will happen is when they do standardize it, you could end up being in crypto that is never going to be optimized in Intel chips and ARM chips and these types of things. So, you should probably solve that problem, but that sounds more like a 2025 or 2030 problem. Well, good governance is the ability to know how to solve problems and know which problems to solve and when, and then to build enough consensus that when you go and solve those problems, that those solutions are legitimate, meaning that you carry the people along. Elections are great examples of this. The last election in America that everybody was happy with seems like 1988 when H.W. Bush was elected. Every Republican elected since, basically, and actually now Democrat, the whole America, half of it disagrees with it. So every action that elected official takes is illegitimate. Well, analogously, when you look like on a blockchain governance system, if it doesn't work well, what happens is every time you make a controversial decision, you end up with a Cardano Classic or Cardano Charles's Vision or Cardano Cash or, these types of things. That's a failure of governance. So you have to balance that, the balance and representation of different constituencies, the ability to generate a collective wisdom of knowing what to do, when to do it, and the efficacy to do it well, and then the legitimacy that once you do it, that people accept that and say, okay, even though I might disagree with it, I'm going to get along and help you out and make sure it gets done and not passively resist it. Good governance systems have all those properties, and it's hard to do that because we're geographically distributed. Cardano's in more than 100 countries. The sun never sets on the project. There's millions of people floating around, and obviously they have radically different views of what good governance is. And to create a system that can balance all of that is actually harder than creating a nation state. And yet we've made enormous progress, on that problem. I think we're going to crack it, and that's the big competitive differentiator.
And what would you like your particular role to be in Cardano governance? I mean, you have a large amount of involvement with the project. How do you see your role in that evolving over the next few years?
Well, I'd love to be in a position where, I'm in a building on role. I wanted Cardano to exist because I really believe in banking the unbanked and giving economic agency to those who don't have it. But the problem is there was no system that was fit for purpose to deliver that we could believe in and not doom people 10, 20 years to being captured and controlled by some big central bureaucracy. So Cardano kind of needed to exist for that. And there's a whole bunch of things like Lace and Prism and our RealFi play and Midnight that we're building right now that are building on top of Cardano or using Cardano technology, but don't require us to be in a direct governance role. So that's one dimension where we want to be involved permanently and always have a place there. And then by creating members-based organization Intersect, what that allows us to do is kind of similar to how Linux works, where Samsung and Google and Microsoft and Apple and Amazon, they all rely on Linux for core infrastructure, whether it be Android or their servers or devices. Well, they have to have a say in the Linux kernel, but nobody's in control of the Linux kernel. Nobody wakes up and says, well, the Linux kernel should have this, and that person has unilateral authority. And they basically can override Google and Microsoft. That just doesn't happen. So there's a lot of lessons there with MBOs to adopt, and we'd like to be voice in the conversation, just like Microsoft voice in web standards, but not the controller of it. And it's the same with Cardano. So we'll provide a lot of opinion on roadmap and priorities and vision. Obviously, we still have the world's largest and best cryptocurrency research group. We have 168 researchers affiliated in that group and 180 papers, over 10,000 citations. We're not going to stop. We're going to keep writing great, amazing papers and solving exceedingly hard problems. But, we're just a voice and a chorus about how to apply those solutions and where and when those make sense. And I think we're converging to a structure that has the maturity and discipline necessary to take advantage of that and really value it and use it. Doesn't mean, though, that we get basically to decide. And that's what decentralization is all about. By the way, just as a North Star, we put a grant into University of Edinburgh to start something called the Decentralization Index, the Edinburgh Decentralization Index, for just this reason. Because what it can do is objectively measure cryptocurrencies, whether it be Bitcoin or Ethereum, and create a metric based on many different parameters, how decentralized that ecosystem is. So what we'd like to do is our role in addition to making Cardano more useful and competitive, especially for the kinds of things that we'd like to solve, like preservation of freedom of association, commerce, expression, or economic agency, is to also try to ensure that the system stays decentralized and continues to improve its level of decentralization against its neighbors in a very objective, improvable way.
I remember reporting on that news of the collaboration with Edinburgh University, Charles. Can I just dial back a moment ago? You mentioned MBO. Can you just clarify what that means, just for anyone listening who's unfamiliar?
Yeah, this is very common in the open source world. So let's say you're like the W3C and you have web standards like HTML and CSS, or you're the IETF, which talks about internet standards and governance, or you're Linux and you need to develop the Linux kernel. These types of things. The problem is there's a lot of people, in many cases, competitors. Like, for example, Samsung and Google are big competitors of each other. But at the same time, they have to coordinate, cooperate on standards and technology. So what a members-based organization does is it gives you a safe space for the NFT, in our case, the NFT community, DeFi community, the core developers, commercial interests of the system to join working groups and eventually consolidate to a universal backlog for the product. And then that backlog can go and be executed by developers from many different companies. And you have a truly decentralized open source movement that's kind of merit-based. So it's kind of like, what was it, the Jungle Book, where they have that watering hole where everybody can go and drink water, but then the lions won't eat you and the tiger won't eat you. Well, it's the same situation here. You can have competitors safely sit down, and in that context and place, they can basically discuss universal principles. So with our own ecosystem, we have Muesli Swap and Min Swap and Sunday Swap and Wing Riders and all these different dexes. Well, technically they're competitors, but there's going to be universal things that all of them would rely upon that they'd like to see. And so through the SIP process and an MBO, they can discuss that, and that can become a property of the roadmap, and nobody gains an unfair advantage over it. You see the same thing in Wi-Fi. There's Wi-Fi 6 and 6E, soon to be Wi-Fi 7. Well, Netgear is a competitor of Asus and all these other guys that makers, but they all have to support the same protocol because you want your phone to be able to connect to the router and not care what the brand of the router is. You can't even see the router if you're in the airport. So you need to have a standards approach, and the only way you get there is by having a members-based organization. So we're borrowing about 40 years of practices from the open source movement, from businesses, and upgrading that to basically work in tandem with an on-chain governance system. And I think between these two things, we can sort out a lot of the problems historically Bitcoin has had with its inability to upgrade, and Ethereum has had with its over-centralization of its roadmap, and ultimately poor quality protocol choices that they've made recently.
Sorry to interrupt you folks, but I have to let you know about the Coin Bureau deals page. Now, my team and I have been able to pull together some of the best promos and discounts in the crypto space. We're talking trading fee discounts of over 50%, thousands of dollars in bonus airdrops, amazing deals at top exchanges, reduced prices on hardware wallets, and much, much more besides. So just go to coinbureau.com/deals, also linked to below, and find the promo suited to you. Enjoy the rest of the video.
I remember reporting on that news of the collaboration with Edinburgh University, Charles. Can I just dial back a moment ago? You mentioned MBO. Can you just clarify what that means, just for anyone listening who's unfamiliar?
Yeah, this is very common in the open source world. So let's say you're like the W3C and you have web standards like HTML and CSS, or you're the IETF, which talks about internet standards and governance, or you're Linux and you need to develop the Linux kernel. These types of things. The problem is there's a lot of people, in many cases, competitors. Like, for example, Samsung and Google are big competitors of each other. But at the same time, they have to coordinate, cooperate on standards and technology. So what a members-based organization does is it gives you a safe space for the NFT, in our case, the NFT community, the DeFi community, the core developers, commercial interests of the system to join working groups and eventually consolidate to a universal backlog for the product. And then that backlog can go and be executed by developers from many different companies. And you have a truly decentralized open source movement that's kind of merit-based. So it's kind of like, what was it, the Jungle Book, where they have that watering hole where everybody can go and drink water, but then the lions won't eat you and the tiger won't eat you. Well, it's the same situation here. You can have competitors safely sit down, and in that context in place, they can basically discuss universal principles. So with our own ecosystem, we have Muesli Swap and Min Swap and Sunday Swap and Wing Riders and all these different dexes. Well, technically they're competitors, but there's going to be universal things that all of them would rely upon that they'd like to see. And so through the SIP process and an MBO, they can discuss that, and that can become a property of the roadmap, and nobody gains an unfair advantage over it. You see the same thing in Wi-Fi. There's Wi-Fi 6 and 6E, soon to be Wi-Fi 7. Well, Netgear is a competitor of, Asus and all these other guys that makers, but they all have to support the same protocol because you want your phone to be able to connect to the router and not care what the brand of the router is. You can't even see the router if you're in the airport. So you need to have a standards approach. And the only way you get there is by having a members-based organization. So we're borrowing about 40 years of it practices from the open source movement, from businesses, and upgrading that to basically work in tandem with an on-chain governance system. And I think between these two things, we can sort out a lot of the problems historically Bitcoin has had with its inability to upgrade, and Ethereum has had with its over-centralization of its roadmap, and ultimately poor quality protocol choices that they've made recently.
And so in that way, you can mitigate, because you can mitigate some of, as you pointed out, so many Cardano protocols are, perhaps in competition with each other. So this MBO model can help mitigate that to an extent and allow them all to move forward and develop.
Yeah, 100%. And if you look at things like, for example, the Apache Foundation or Linux Foundation, Linux has 140 projects. It's not just the Linux kernel, it's Kubernetes. There's a Hyperledger group as part of that. These are competitors that belong to it, yet they somehow managed to get it done. And the vast majority of computers are running something that they've created. So don't reinvent the model if the model is effective. Just take it, refine it, iterate it, and make it useful to us. And what's super cool then is it gives everybody building on Cardano the ability to really look into the future and say, we need to work together on for us to be the best in class chain. The other thing is, how do you get Fortune 500 adoption, government adoption? How do you get big guys with billions of users? They need some sort of outlet that they can join where they can understand the change management and governance system. If it's anarchy and chaos, well, then the best case scenario is just change nothing, in which case, your technology gets extremely stale and you lose a lot of great opportunities, can't adopt good ideas, or you're completely at the mercy of one guy who basically can get compromised or corrupted at any time and then suddenly take the entire ecosystem in a very unproductive way. You're not going to get a government to say, I should build my money system on that, or my voting system on that, or my property registration system, or my credentialing system if they don't understand how governance and change management comes. And they already have all the users. If you get Microsoft or somebody, it's multi-billion people. So it's not a game of where are we at today. It's how do we get to 1 billion people and what types of governance systems are required. Again, there's already really well thought out ways of handling this. They just don't accommodate a token ecosystem. So you need to kind of modify it a little bit to accommodate that with an on-chain governance system where these types of structures operate with the consent of the governed, and it can be revoked should they become ineffective. So you actually not only make the system more compatible, you actually make the system better than what the Linux Foundation can do or the Apache Foundation can do, but you don't lose those capabilities of those systems, which is that ability for competitors to come together cross-chain or within the chain and create some sort of agreements with these things. And by the way, if you've done a really good job, this helps chip away at the tribalism. Because while we may be able to, on Twitter beat each other up, under the hood, we might go work with Algorand or Polkadot or Tezos on things like a post-quantum VRF or things and create standards amongst many different ecosystems. So suddenly we're talking to each other, we're collaborating, we're creating shared standards with each other, which helps the overall interoperability of the space as a whole, which improves the user experience and helps adoption for cryptocurrencies.
And I'd say it would help the perception, I think, of the space as well, because I think for many outsiders looking in, especially, at times like this that are pretty tough for the industry as a whole. I think a lot of people can tend to sort of get crypto, and it's kind of like cats fighting in a sack. The communities, the wider community can't really come together on anything. You pointed out some of the, some of the problems that Bitcoin has with approving upgrades and that sort of stuff. So, yeah, I guess any way that can foster that spirit of cooperation is not.
I'll give you 3 examples real quickly about Bitcoin. So, Bitcoin came up with color coins, which is actually the inspiration for the Cardano native asset system. It would have been very easy for Bitcoin to pull that into the core ledger. And then actually, if Bitcoin would be the #1 chain to issue NFTs on, and it would have probably gotten a huge chunk of the token ecosystem. But because they chose not to embrace a really good idea, which didn't compromise principles at all, they let it die on the vine. Bitcoin came up with a lot of great ideas about how to extend UTXO to include smart contracts. And Blockstream was a good leader there with Simplicity and Jets. And they really came up with some cool things. BitML was another example. So that became the basis for EUTXO and Cardano and Plutus. So there were some great ideas there that came from that ecosystem, but they could never get them over the line. Another example is the sidechains model for Bitcoin. We formalized that. We read the paper in 2014, and we created a primitive called NEPA-POWs in 2016, a non-interactive proofs of proof of work, which basically gives you a really compact certificate for a fast bootstrap, chainless mining, we call it log-space mining, and sidechains. Again, this doesn't compromise the intent and vision of Bitcoin. It doesn't change proof of work. It just allows Bitcoin to be more programmable and useful. But there's no governance system, so that it's impossible to get these amazing ideas into the system. So in the absence of that, competition comes. We say, wow, these are great concepts. Let's put a lot of R&D behind them and make them a lot better. And now we're adopting them. Ergo adopted NEPA-POWs. There's other people that are doing that. It's become Fly Client in the parlance there. Same for Lightning. Tons of great ideas, but damn near impossible to get to its full status because it's impossible to do it with how primitive the Bitcoin programming model is. So something that should be done in a matter of a year takes 10 years because Bitcoin doesn't do it well. Well, Lightning was a good inspiration for Hydra and isomorphic state channels. You see, but you need programmability to make that work correctly. Now we have Hydra, it's on the Cardano mainnet. So we stand on the shoulders of giants. And the problem is that the only reason you get to compete with those giants is because they make mistakes. And the biggest mistake you can make in cryptocurrency land, whether you're a big guy like Bitcoin or Ethereum, or even small people, is poor governance. I'll tell you a story. When I was CEO of Ethereum before the Earth School, very briefly, although everybody likes to focus on that, is the thing that kept me up at night every day was NXT. You might remember it. It was an old Java cryptocurrency, and it's not a thing anymore. There's still a small community, but it's mostly, dead. But the thing was, at the time, it was growing exponentially. They were written in Java, super fast development. They had proof of stake. They had native assets. They were writing smart contracts. They're called automated transactions. Really nice wallet. And the problem they had was bad token launch and bad governance. So bad governance forced them to fracture, and they became Crypty, Lisk, Wave, Scorex. Scorex became Ergo. So had all that stayed together, they probably could have beaten Ethereum. It would have been actually the next Ethereum. So it's governance at the core always in your change management system that will long-term decide whether you live or die, because you can always grow, you can always absorb new technology. Governance keeps what you have and keeps adding. And it might take 10 years to grow to where you want to go, but you don't lose people along the way. You don't lose interest along the way. You get where you need to go.
So in terms of, I'm really curious to know then, Charles, because what you mentioned about the lack of governance with Bitcoin, which has absolutely held it back in so many ways. So what function or role do you see Bitcoin and BTC playing in the future under given those circumstances?
the only role they can play, which is to be digital gold. And that's certainly going to be valuable, and there's certainly going to be the adherence, but they've recused themselves from all the good stuff. It's not going to be a voting system. It's not going to be a DNS system. It's not going to be an identity management system. It's not going to be a supply chain system. It's not going to be an intellectual property management system with NFTs. It's not going to be a DeFi ecosystem. It's not going to be a digital bank. It will never have value stability, so it can't be a credit system or lending system. And don't fucking tell me they're going to do that as a layer 2, because what you're doing is saying, because we can't do that as a cryptocurrency, we handed it all to Bob and his 5 friends in a federated network to run it. How is that any different than the banking extensions we have with the BIS and the FedNet and all these other things we're building? It's not. I'm sorry. So they've recused themselves from all these things because they didn't adopt native multi-asset, extended UTXO, programmability. They don't have to make massive changes. They have to take advantage of the fact that maybe, just maybe, in the 100+ million people that are floating around the cryptocurrency space, a few good ideas have come up in the last 14 years to improve the model. That's the difference between a growing, well-governed ecosystem and a religious monoculture that's a cult. A religious monoculture can't change the Bible because it came from God. So sorry, no matter how brilliant you aren't God. You can't change the doctrine. But if you are an open source project, you could admit that maybe, just maybe, somebody came up with a better idea than the founder, and we can iterate in that. Now, if you can, you get to go and be a participant in all those new amazing things. If you can't, you have to basically just recuse yourself and watch from afar in an ever decreasing role in relevance until eventually you become completely irrelevant, or you have a very well-defined role. Now, it doesn't mean we don't venerate what's been accomplished and say it's amazing. We're all here for Bitcoin, because I came from the Bitcoin space. I entered in 2011. There was nothing else back. We had Namecoin. I think Litecoin was just getting started. We had, it was cool, but the world's moved on, and there's a lot more to do there. So what we tried to do in the Cardano ecosystem is learn from that, take the good ideas, but then eschew the bad ones, and then build a governance system so that we're just as relevant 10 years from now as we are today, if not more so. And that's really the thing that's going to make the big difference between the cryptocurrencies and blockchain ecosystems that are here to stay and the ones that die.
Yeah. Just quickly, Dumpling, you have your hand up. Did you have a question for Charles?
Yeah, thanks. I have a follow-up question, Charles. So talking about governance, I'm talking as a representative, maybe like myself and many ordinary retail holders and the small people. When we hear about the word governance, we think about grand schemes, big plans, and sometimes it kind of scares us away from participating or even think about participating. So can you explain to us, perhaps using Cardano's governance as an example, how can ordinary people, retail crypto holders, or even just enthusiasts, how can we be involved in governance?
Well, it starts with kind of 3 different dimensions that you have to balance, and this is a deeply personal question. First is your available knowledge and personal resources. So how much time do you have to commit? What background do you have? What's your level of engagement and interest that you have? So this ranges from, I have a PhD in computer science and I'm a fanatical loyalist and I've decided to devote my life to this. I've shaved my head and got the Cardano tattoo on my skull. Okay, so that's one dimension. To all the way on the other side, like, hey, I like the word Cardano. It's pretty cool. It's fun to say. Maybe I'm going to go to a meetup group or, just read Reddit or something like that. So there's obviously a big spectrum there, and you live somewhere in that 3-dimensional grid. And you have to pick that. And then based on that, if it's a good governance system, there should be a mapping of where that dot falls to where you go and participate. So you either participate as a DREP or getting to a DREP or a collection of DREPs, or you participate in a DREP that's federated, meaning multiple people control that DREP. So those who don't know, that stands for delegated representative. And so it's a certificate on chain that you can register that either an individual or a group of people control, and then people delegate stake to them. And kind of like liquid democracy, the Pirate Party came up with this back 20 years ago. And the basic concept is that once you have it, you have a vote on many different governance actions in the system, from should we hard fork to how should we do the budget of Cardano or these types of things. You can participate in the institutions that are forming, like the foundation has lots of cool things that they're doing. There's the SIP process, the members-based organization, the working groups. So where that dot is, you can participate there. Or maybe you're a real big person in the ecosystem and you want to actually be elected to an office and serve a term. And that's the kind of the idea that we have with the Constitutional Committee. So, or maybe you serve as a state pool operator because, well, you're not super passionate about, let's say, whether we should spend treasury on A, B, or C. You do have a lot of DevOps experience and you like running the chain and you want to participate in consensus. So the first step is to help people understand where they fall and then make sure that there's a good mapping. And then if we're a good governance system, regardless if you're part-time or full-time, there's a place to land and there's good systems for that. By the way, that's going to be one of the KPIs of Intersect as a members-based organization. In addition to taking custodianship of the roadmap and the product backlog and being an aggregation point for the developers to write good code on a quarterly basis for good releases, one of their facilities needs to be helping in that mapping activity and educating people and creating good content materials so that people know where to go. Obviously, it's a game of numbers, and what you do is you start with your radicalized, highly ambitious minority that really just wants every day to be part of it, and you call them up on a one-by-one basis and say, boy, you need to go do this or that, because that's really connected to your passions. But at some point you exhaust that field, and then you need to move to a model where it's that you train the trainer, it's self-selecting, like with any political surrogacy. And that's the next step. After we get Intersect fully established as an ecosystem, and if 1694 gets voted on chain and that turns on, is the very next step is to build those bridges so that everyday people can click in and they're able to be kind of part-time in the system. The Constitutional Convention is a great example of that, where we have a MVP constitution for the initial instantiation, but by design it's meant to be upgraded. So one of the things that we'd like to see is 100 plus workshops in 100 plus countries around the world, electing delegates and sending all of them to vote on a permanent constitution for Cardano until it gets updated. Well, that's a very inclusive project, because you could potentially be in Jordan or in Burundi or Mongolia, and you could be a member of that workshop. You don't have to actually travel anywhere. You talk to some people and elect somebody to represent you, and that person go to Argentina and actually vote and has the same level of vote as I have. One delegate, one vote. That's an example of a very inclusive governance system, and it allows people to contribute where they think they feel best. And if you do that, you harness the power of the majority. You get this amazing wisdom of the crowds, and that kind of transcends, and it's diverse enough to make sure that everybody's protected and no one party can come in and change the protocol for a permanent monopoly to harm everyone else.
Thank you, Charles. A follow-up. What would you say is the fundamental difference between the delegated representatives versus the current elected politicians that we have in existing governments?
Well, the problem with the current politicians we have is you get the worst of all worlds. You get political parties, you get regionalization, and you get firms. And the issue is there's no responsiveness to that. So if you're a senator, you care a lot about what the people of Kentucky say. If you happen to live in Kentucky, if you happen to live in Colorado, you don't give a shit at all. You only care about the Colorado voices. So if you do something that harms the people of Kentucky, you feel no political fallout for that. So that's one issue. The other issue is if you're on a term, and 6-year term, you're very responsive to the whims and wishes and will of the voter. Immediately after you get elected, you can tell them go fuck themselves until about maybe 4 years into your term. Then you care a lot about what they care because you're running again. You see, so terms do tend to they give you the advantage of political insulation against controversy, but if you have political parties and one-party systems, especially like California or Wyoming, it creates basically an insular nature where you're a king. Once you've been elected, you're in for life. And you could be 80 years old and show signs of dementia or have like grand mal seizures or things like that, or petit mal seizures like while speaking, and you can't be removed from office, or you're clearly suffering from dementia. You don't even know where you're at, yet apparently you get to vote on whether we should go to war or not, and no one can get you out of office because of the way the politics. That's a very bad system. When you have a delegated representative, you have liquid democracy. So your influence and control is proportional to how well people perceive you're doing that job today. Just like a stake pool operator. If you run a stake pool and you stop making blocks very quickly, people will pull their delegation because they don't make any money. You're not doing the job. Well, analogously, if you're DREP and it's constructed the right way, if you don't represent the interests people have delegated to you, well, then those people are going to pull their delegation very quickly, and your influence and power is now greatly diminished or completely removed. Furthermore, this is a global system. So there's no differentiation between the state of Kentucky or Colorado. Everybody in the world. It's one global governance state. Now, terms do make sense, especially when you're trying to be a custodian of a philosophy. So if you combine both those models together in the right way, in a bicameral or tricameral way, I think you get the best of both worlds. The issue is we combine them in the wrong way in the United States because we never anticipated the rise of political parties or the really overreaching power of the federal government. So the Constitution was never able to protect us from the consequences of that. So we kind of thought really carefully, how do we avoid that regionalization and ensure that it's one global system? And I think that's a good starting point. But it's important to understand that this is minimum viable governance. So by design, what's going to happen is you're going to have some things you love and it works really well. And there's going to be some things you hate and they're really terrible. And a good governing system should have the ability to change itself. In America, we all know the government sucks. It's universal. Everybody agrees. They just disagree about where it sucks, but we all agree it sucks. Okay. It's like getting kicked in the face or the nuts. It doesn't matter. It still hurts. It's a bad thing. Okay. And so the problem is that if you don't have a change management system, you're probably going to get kicked in both the face and the nuts at the same time. So it's the same situation with the US government. So what we need to do is recognize that we have to be able to change what we've built. The system's correctly designed. It has institutions built within it to either fire people who aren't performing well, to quickly change control, and to update and modernize the system to reflect the needs of the system, especially with emerging technology. Like the US voting system was built around this idea that people had to get on a horse and ride somewhere. That's why we have electoral college. Well, we don't really have that notion anymore, but yet we have that legacy artifact, and we preserve and protect it as a tradition, but it in many cases can get in the way of where we are as a society. So I think you need a renewal, refresh. You need the ability to change the governing system, and then you don't get kicked in the wrong places.
So we talked about this in Denver last week. I really love your answer, and I think it could be counterintuitive to many people. So I want everyone here to hear that. If you think the community is taking the governance to a place of potential failure, would you be intervening? Charles, we know you have great influence and great knowledge. What would your course of action be?
Well, there's a great hubris that people have when they're founders, that they think they always know best and that this is always the way to go. And it actually paralyzes organizations. In many cases, even after the founder dies. Like Disney is the greatest example of this, where for 20 years after Disney died, everybody at Disney would say, well, that's not what Walt Disney would have done. And that's not what Walt Disney would have wanted. And it just created that culture. You see it at Apple for over 10 years. It's like, well, Steve Jobs wouldn't have done that. Steve Jobs, it's one guy. And the reality is, no matter how brilliant a founder is, the system as a whole, is probably collectively smarter. So what you do is you have to differentiate the monster of the week from core principles in the system. And so if it violates a core principle, like we've decided we're going to go, triple the supply of ADA, or we've decided we're going to centralize the whole system forever around Bob or something like that, well, then obviously you have to be a conscientious objector and say, I can't morally support this. But if it's not of that magnitude, then if you disagree with it, then what you have to do is you have to say, look, I've had my say, I participated in the process, and the process has moved in a different direction. I still care about the mission, value, and goals, and I still want the system to succeed. So even though I disagree with it, how do I help get it done? And let's go get that done. We have this problem in the United States right now that if our side doesn't win, we don't agree to help whatever's been decided get done and try to make sure it's okay. What the politics are is you have to destroy it. So we're going to resist and stop it. And then once we get back in power, then we should be able to completely undo it. Look, Obamacare is a great example of that in the United States. And so they passed the Affordable Care Act. I personally think there was a lot of bad stuff in there. There was some really good stuff in there. For example, the pre-existing conditions mandate, the things about sharing medical data, trying to get people into electronic medical record systems. There was some good there, but there are a lot of bad in there. Well, it shouldn't have been, well, let's throw the whole thing away and repeal it. It should have been, well, okay, well, how do we correct some of the deficits and actually make the system better for everybody? Because, we're getting a poor product and everybody agrees about that. Okay, so it's the same with governance. If you disagree with something, if it doesn't violate a core principle, then you have to say, okay, how can I help and be part of this and keep pushing it forward? Another thing too is that your leadership has a shelf life, no matter who you are. And it's okay to be an emeritus, venerated person, and we honor them for the things that they did. But at some point, you're no longer effective because the technology, culture, and interests have moved into a different role. Winston Churchill is a great example of that, where he was a really effective wartime leader for Britain, and he was extremely good at rallying them to go and fight an existential threat. But he was actually voted out of office after World War II. So he went from a super popular figure who said, we will fight them in the streets, and rousing speeches and radio casts and getting a whole nation to stand up against a pure evil army, hopped up on meth. And then suddenly, a few years later, he's no longer in charge. So everybody has a place and a purpose and a time. And part of leadership is knowing when not to be in the room and allowing other opinions to be there and to grow. And sometimes the system has to remind you of that. That's why in the United States, we passed term limits for the president, because there was a precedent that the president should only serve 2 terms. For the most part, vast majority of U.S. presidents agreed with that, ran for a 3rd term, and Teddy Roosevelt ran for a 3rd term. But for the most part, they kept it constrained and they didn't win. Then suddenly FDR got 4 terms. And we said, look, the presidency is not a king. Every fiber of the American experience from the very beginning, we made that agreement that that's not the case. You can't have a popular president in power for 30 years. It would make him a king. So they passed a constitutional amendment to prevent them from doing that. So similarly, what you do in leadership and governance is that the OGs at some point sometimes will overstep, and it's very important for the community to step up, remind them of their place and role, and say, well, we respect you. We also have the right to disagree, and we've decided we want to go in this particular direction. And as a leader, you have to accept that and know that perhaps it's no longer your place to be involved in these types of things. And it's always emotional because you created it. But yeah, every parent goes through this where their kids grow up and they go to college and they move on, and then you're starting to listen to Cats in the Cradle a lot more, and it's okay. Life moves on.
But Charles, do you think there's a way then? Because I hear what you say, and especially about term limits, and that desire not to end up with a system that they got rid of the Brits for. But do you think there's a way? Because I think sometimes these term limits, and we have it with parliamentary limits in the UK as well, sometimes that encourages perhaps sort of short-term thinking. So a government won't, or a president won't really look much beyond the end of their, perhaps second term, or their most recent term, because that's it for them. Once they're out, they can't do any more. And so you see that with things like, infrastructure is a good example. That's a long-term thing that people need to, that countries need to have. I guess my question is, can we design a system that has the best of both worlds, that imposes limits to stop kings and dictators, but also encourages a long-term view?
Well, this is the challenge, and this is why I like the idea of blending electoral roles with institutions like members-based organizations, because MBOs kind of represent long-term thinking, and they represent how do we build things that last the test of time. Like when you create a standard with the IETF, that could be running like TCP/IP for 40 years. So there's definitely institutions, thought processes that you can put in, especially an infrastructure that creates that longevity. And what you do is you also have to separate the election of the values and goals and direction from the people. The problem that we have with the United States and a lot of democracies is tend to couple both of those and say, we don't just elect the guy, Joe Biden or Donald Trump, or the gal, Maggie Thatcher, or, pick your favorite leader. We elect the guy, gal with the vision. And then when you elect a new guy and gal, you elect new vision. Well, corporations don't work this way. If you replace the CEO of a major corporation, you still have a board of directors, shareholders, and you have a strategy. And that new CEO that comes in may be a slave and custodian to a strategy, and their job is to be the executor of it. So I think if we've designed this the right way, what's going to happen in principle is you're going to have a budget process and a vision process where every year the decentralized community comes together and they kind of decide on a budget for the Cardano ecosystem, and roughly speaking, what the vision of the Cardano ecosystem is. Then your elected officials and your institutions are about how good are they at executing that vision. So you get continuity, and people then have to argue that they've done their job. Right now in the political system, they argue that the other person is incompetent and evil and an existential threat. So put me in power to protect you from the evil, incompetent, existential threat other person. But you notice they never actually talk about some universally accepted principles. Like never once have I seen a State of the Union address where we've all agreed that there's 10 KPIs that America should pay attention to, and they come in and they talk about how they've made those KPIs better. I've never seen it. And no matter who the politician is that's taking that podium, it's always, we're amazing and the other side is evil. And we've done such a great job, but you wouldn't believe it. Believe me, my job is so good. I'm so brilliant. We hire the best people. And those other guys are so evil. And the other side's like, you lie. It's not a reasonable thing. And so instead what you need to do is say, okay, what does it mean for Cardano? Well, you have North Stars. Like the Edinburgh Decentralization Index. You say, okay, let's say let's pick an arbitrary number. Let's say it's 100 because we're still normalizing the scale. Let's say we're 32. Well, if you have a good governing system, it should be able to come back 5 years later and say we've gone from 32 to 52, whatever the fuck that means. And we all agree. We say, oh, wow, that's a huge improvement. Similarly, for transaction volume, for TVL, for the amount of dApps in the ecosystem, the amount of active projects, VC funding of those projects, systems that have adopted it, its level of relevance and impact. There's got to be objective metrics you could look at. And the governance layer of Cardano, they can set a vision and goal and say, we set these KPIs and targets about growth and adoption. And then your governing executors, they'll go take money to go and do that. And then if they do a good job, it's objective and it's measurable. If they don't do a good job, you fire them and you replace them. That's why I always say an MBO instead of the MBO. Why? Because it's just one members-based organization. And if it does a poor job, the consent of the governed gets revoked. And what happens is the governed fire them, or political entity forms. And they basically have now competing projects. It's the same for the core client of Cardano. We've relied a lot on academic Haskell. It's amazing, but at some point we have to simplify some of the design and have client diversity so people can start specializing. There's a Go implementation that they're already working on one, and a TypeScript implementation, these types of things. And certain teams will beat other teams. And in that competition, it actually is better for the ecosystem as a whole if you're careful about how you do it. So I think you just have to never allow the enemy of good to be better. And say, just because we can't come up with a perfect system, let's just not do it. What you have to do is say, where did they go wrong? And how do you build checks and balances in your system? And then again, going back to, can we change the governance system? If you come up with a good way of doing that, well, then what you do is you change your system to correct deficits and problems that you see. And you make that part of the budgeting process, that you invest money and time and research into building a better system.
That old-fashioned idea of cooperation, collaboration. Yeah,
that we used to do, which is sad because it's how you get things done.
Yeah. And can I ask, Charles, because you mentioned the Cardano ecosystem there, and I know a lot of people listening will want to know a bit about what's been happening there recently, because statistics show that the use and adoption of Cardano has been climbing a lot in recent months. Things like TVL, total value locked, is climbing, more dApps, more users, etc. This is despite, of course, the crypto bear market, despite the SEC, etc. So why is that, do you think? What do you think's attracting people to Cardano at a time when, let's face it, overall interest in crypto and particularly market sentiment are really, really low?
What's so crazy about all this is I've been in crypto for so long. I remember when Bitcoin was $1, and this idea of like $1 trillion ecosystem I was like, whatever crack you're smoking, it must be the most magical drug in the world. And now it's just like, oh God, we're in such a bear market. We're only at $1 trillion. There's only 100 million people floating around. It's like, what is going on here? This is nuts. It's still surreal to me that in 13 years' time, we've been able to achieve as much as we have. With respect to Cardano in particular and its growth in the bear market, Plutus 2 came out, Fossil hard fork. And whenever you build a new programming language, because you got to remember, we have a lot of people at I.O. who wrote programming languages for a living. Like Phil Wadler, for example, and Kevin Ham and others, they created Haskell back in 1985. And so we know everybody who's ever written a programming language, from the C++ days to Java. It's like, we're pretty good at this. So you go and talk to those guys, you see, how long does it take to build an ecosystem around popular programming language, be it Rust or Python or whatever? Minimum 3 to 7 years. So Alonzo came out at the end of 2021. Fossil came out in 2022. And so we're starting to actually get to a point where the dev experience looks pretty good. So it's no coincidence that there's now hundreds of applications being built on Cardano, and those applications are starting to actually get TVL and grow. What happened was, because instantly, the minute the programming language didn't come out, the entire Ethereum community and others, they went and said, oh, that must mean that Cardano's a huge failure. It's failed to launch and no one cares about it. No, it's just the natural growth curve that Ethereum had to go through, Bitcoin had to go through, and everybody else who's here to stay had to go through. Rust is another great example. If you talk to a person right when Rust came out, they say there's no way that anybody would choose Rust over C++. There's just no way. Now it's the #1 language to choose over C++ for infrastructure code, because it has all the values and power of C++, but it also has a lot more there that's for a modern language. And if you're a new programmer, that's where you start, as opposed to C++. Similarly, people are starting to really appreciate deterministic fees. They're starting to really appreciate the parallelism of the GTXO model. There's great things like Aiken and Marlowe that have come to really simplify the development experience for a lot of people. There's great libraries that have formed. There's good tooling and infrastructure in the community, for example, TX Pipe, and just so much organic growth that's there, very similar to when we saw Ethereum start to develop with Solidity and Open Zeppelin and Infura and Alchemy, all these things that came out of the closet to basically give a good dev ecosystem. Well, the same is happening for us. And also we have layer 2 stuff that's there, like Hydra and Mithril. We have great sidechains like DC Spark to Macomata that brings EVM support into the ecosystem. So it's there now, and it's working well. And there's great marketplaces like JPEG Store is here. There's people that build good frameworks like NMaker to issue NFTs. About a third of all the NFTs on Cardano have been issued through their technology. There's Oracle solutions like Charlie 3 that's now here. We have algorithmic stablecoins like JED. There's other stablecoins that are in the ecosystem. So of course those things are there. But remember, all of that is coupled with liquid non-custodial staking. So you're not in the Hotel California. There's not 2 guys that control the whole thing. All of that is coupled with over 2,100 days of uptime, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, never gone down. All of that is coupled with one of the most decentralized backbones and incredibly reliable code that basically prevents you from shooting yourself in the face. So if I was a developer, I'd say an ecosystem that has legs. It's not going anywhere. It's getting more interoperable. It's getting easier to work with. And in a few years' time, it's not only going to be the easiest to work with, it's also going to have the most predictable and lowest cost fees to be on. Because our scalability plans are so organic. Like, we know how to do fast finality. We have a really good idea. It's a matter of time. It's inevitable to see very easily rollups come in, and very easy to get better data availability story, very easy to have a consensus algorithm that can do an extremely high TPS rate. By the way, people lie all the time. They say 1 transaction per block. If you look at peak throughput of extended UTXO, the way we have it right now, it's in 100 plus, 200 plus TPS, just with what we have today. So there is absolutely no problem here. It's just you have to find a better way of using the hardware. It's very similar, like if people play Nintendo way back in the day, it blows people's minds that it's the exact same hardware, Super Mario, Mario Brothers 1, Mario Brothers 3. Look at the difference in that game. One is just like bad pixels, and it's very primitive gameplay, and you only have a few power-ups, and there's just nothing there. And then Super Mario and Mario Brothers 3 comes out, and you actually have a giant world map and complex level design and much better music and all kinds of things. It's the exact same hardware that runs that game versus the other game. So it's the same situation. People are learning how to use extended UTXO and Plutus, and they're building frameworks. So what we're doing is we're starting to move to the Mario Brothers 2 era. Within an upgrade or two, we'll be in the Mario Brothers 3 era, and before you know, we'll be in Super Nintendo. And it's happening much faster than a lot of people in the other ecosystem. And by the way, we're not laden with horrific design mistakes like the EVM has, with this bizarre concept of a global state, non-deterministic fees, a really hard time sharding. These are things that kill enterprise adoption and kill government adoption, because they say, guys, we can't have a system where it's $50 today and it's $100 tomorrow and it's $10 on Saturday. We can't have a system where you flip one line of code and then suddenly have a reentrancy bug and now hack happens. We can't have a system that requires 2 PhDs in computer science and 20 years of fucking around with stuff. They tried to do state channels before us. It was called It's super easy for us to get channel isomorphism with the extended UTXO model. It's super hard to do that with an accounts model. That's why they abandoned it, went to rollups and the monster of the week. We get both. And it's much easier to do a rollups than an extended UTXO system. So people are waking up to that. They're learning that. And they say, oh, wow, I can do more than Mario Brothers. I can have I can have the raccoon tail and the Tatsuki suit and all this other cool stuff. And they're getting excited about it.
Do you feel kind of vindicated then in your sort of approach? If the Silicon Valley approach has been kind of move fast and break things, sort of the wider crypto space, if you like, whereas Cardano has been kind of more, measure twice, cut once. Do you feel vindicated in that, in choosing that path to go down?
Well, history is going to vindicate, because it'll ultimately be a game of principles and adoption. And guys, it's not a game of Ethereum versus Cardano versus Algorand versus Solana. If you think that that's the game, we've already lost. The game is crypto versus CBDCs. That's the game. There's social credit in CBDCs for 1.2 billion people in China. It's coming, and it's already rolling it out. They already, with social credit, decide whether you get to ride the train, get your passport or not. Well, it's very trivial to say, we're going to put that on your money now. And there's so many people in the ESG movement that say, hey, you've already filled up your car once this week, so we're not going to let you buy gasoline until next week. They're writing memos about how this is the single best way of preventing climate changes, is incentivizing climate-friendly behavior through the money system. So the minute they have a CBDC, transaction discrimination happens, and then it's going to be discriminated on 2 different axes: what you do with it and who you are. And if you are part of a political minority that's being persecuted, basically you get shut out of society. And if you're doing things that the government structure with no democratic oversight has decided, you don't get to do that anymore. You're shut out of your money. It's the dream of every despot, and it's in real time for about 1/7 of the entire world. And it's going to come to Europe and America. The only way to get out of that is we have to go back to principles-based money and principles-based financial and economic systems. Every single cryptocurrency project that's a real legitimate project is making contributions to fight that fight. Ethereum has done phenomenal work in the zero knowledge space and roll-up space, and there's a lot of great ideas in the layer 2 system, and also just this whole smart contract model. It brought that to the forefront. Don't criticize it, make it better and improve it. The same for Bitcoin. There was a lot of great ideas there that they couldn't execute because of their governance system, that we borrowed and improved and made Cardano so much better for that. But we're all together, and the vindication will be the adoption of these principles and philosophies. It's hard to say which particular protocol is going to win, because all kinds of crazy things could happen in society. There could be the West globally banning everything, and some guys in India, they suddenly legitimize it and they build something, and the whole world adopts that. That could happen. It could happen out of Africa. It could happen out of South America. That's okay. That's the monster of the week. But the principles have to stay the same. We have to have economic agency. We have to have self-sovereign identity. We have to be our own banks. We have to be in charge of our own life and destiny. And we could never create a system that can arbitrarily and capriciously persecute a political minority because the government's decided they're inconvenient, or be used to social engineer all of us towards some sort of bizarre end where life is not so good. I do not want the 21st century to live that way, and the tools are too good for tyranny. The Stasi would have a wet dream over what's capable, what these systems can do. So we can't allow that to happen. So that's the real fight, and let's always remind ourselves of that. And vindication would be that side loses.
I think that's it's refreshing to hear that, Charles, because I think, again, touching on the tribalism that we talked about that's so inherent in crypto and in the industry. Are you confident that all these entities within crypto can come together and cooperate enough to head off threats like CBDCs? Do you feel that we're capable of doing that as an industry?
Oh, if we can solve it in Cardano, we can solve it anywhere. It's like that song: if you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. So the thing is, we have all these competitors. If our DeFi ecosystem can come together, even though they're competitors with each other, and work together, why the hell can't blockchains come together and work together, even though they're competitors? And if blockchains can come together and work together, 100 million people there. You know what 100 million people is? That's a country. That's a political movement. And then people say, CryptoStan is doing a hell of a lot better job than anybody else. Why don't we have that? And we'll win the young people over, and the young people will be in charge at some point. And we'll get it done, and we'll get it done through a peaceful democratic process, as opposed to how it usually is done, which is a war. That's usually what defines where the world goes. And this could be the first century where we didn't succumb. Every century in human history, we've had that happen, and this is the one where I'm most optimistic. And I think the right roots are there, and we're evolving as a species. So let's solve it in Cardano, then let's solve it chain, and then let's solve it for the world.
Amen to that. Dumpling, you had a question.
I had a quick follow-up regarding vindication, CBDCs, and government control. Perhaps it sounds a bit ominous, but I think it's realistic. When blockchain governance is being built, we're participating in it. It's not a matter of if, but a matter of when the current governments would feel threatened. What if they start to take actions such as arresting people, freezing your assets? Like even in China, if you own Bitcoin, you're mining Bitcoin, you already face the threat of prison. So realistically, what can we do?
Oh, it's like they're not taking action already. How's Uncle Gary working for everybody? There's already a war on crypto. Operation Choke Point 2.0 is underway. People are being debanked. Arbitrary rulings are coming in. The government, the courts are trying to remind it that it's a country of laws, and the executive branch is overstepped. And you got all these big transnational institutions like the World Bank and the BIS and others that are led by Jabba the Hutt, and they are basically just coming at us as an industry. They're just doing it in a very silent and organized way, but it's very clear that they're trying to end cryptocurrencies. Look, there is risk, but at the end of the day, the stakes are high because it's about your children, it's about your future, it's about your economic agency, and there's plenty of people who take risk in life. I have a great security detail. Almost all of them serve military and war, and we ask people on a daily basis to defend freedom. And you have to set personally what your red lines are and what you feel as a human being, how you should be treated. Always, there's going to be somebody who shows up who says, you know what, I'm going to take your humanity from you. We see this in abusive relationships. Somebody will go and date somebody, and that person says, well, now you're not allowed to have friends unless I approve them, and I'm going to take over your bank account, and I'm going to take your credit card. And there's so many millions of people in relationships like that, and it's dehumanizing and destructive, and perhaps they don't want to break up because of family considerations or kids or economic dependency, but that doesn't make it right, doesn't make it moral, and no society should promote that. The single most abusive relationship we currently have right now is with our governments. They say they own us, and if we don't take care of them, they basically will put us in cages. Look at the U.S. financial policy right now. Every single thing I do anywhere in the world, they have to know about. And no matter where I live, and if they're involved in it or not, they get a big chunk of it. And then at the end of the day, even after I do every single thing they ask, they can just invent new laws on the fly and apply them retroactively. It's immoral, it's wrong, it's arbitrary, and it's an example of an abusive relationship. And the point of governance and institutional rights and constitutional rights is resetting these relationships so they're not abusive, toxic, and traumatic anymore. And we have to do this as a world. It is not okay for people to be dictators anymore in the 21st century. It's not okay to have kings anymore. We were the OG king killers in the United States. We're pretty good at it. That's why I don't really give a shit about what Meghan and Harry do these days. We had a war, so we didn't have to care about what they did. Okay, so we have to remind people again and again that laws require bilateral consent. And if laws are unjust, government actions are unjust, you, through the courts and the democratic process, resist them. And if they still stand up, then just like with apartheid in South Africa or other things, you become political prisoners. And there's certainly some people who will bear that brunt. But over the arc of history, whether it be Gandhi or Mandela, we will see it through. Because at the end of the day, all we're fighting for is honesty, immutability, transparency, irreversibility. All we're fighting for is inclusive accountability, where when you claim something, we can verify it ourselves. All we're fighting for is economic agency, where we're in charge of our money and the fruits of our property and our labors. All we're fighting for is protection of the minorities. That's what we're fighting for. And if people say that that's wrong or we shouldn't have the right to do that, what they're really saying under the hood is not all humans are created equally. And some are betters over others, and you have to get in line for betters. You know what? We're past that as a species. So you have to establish red lines, and you have to fight for those red lines. And you just look at it in a very personal way, like an abusive relationship. And what you do is you have immutable things, and if they violate them, you end the relationship and you move on. And governments are no different.
It's scary, but also reassuring, Charles, isn't it? That we do face so many threats from technology, and CBDCs being a good example. But at least we have this technology that's on our side, essentially, in the form of blockchain. At least we have a way of evolving and fighting back against what you were just talking about.
100%. The doctrine of replace don't be evil with can't be evil. Google had don't be evil across their whole company, and they had a guy whose day job was to scrub it and remove every reference to don't be evil. I can't remember the exact year they did it, but it was somewhere in the 2000s. Yeah. Well, they did it because shareholders are shareholders, and money is money, and they knew who their bosses were. And they've always had a very uncomfortable relationship with the CIA and the FBI and others. Well, now let's be can't be evil. So let's recognize that perhaps humans are really bad judges of fairness and equality, and no matter how much we want to write it down and pretend it's true, we're going to violate it when it's inconvenient to us. And so let's make it like the laws of physics, where no matter how inconvenient gravity is to us, we're all kind of constrained by it. We have to accept its consequences. And then once you have a social system built on those bedrocks, you have integrity. And with integrity, people can trust each other again. And if they can trust each other, they can work with each other. And when we work together, we can build a better world.
I guess in part it's because I think most people are. I like to believe that most people are fundamentally good, but of course there's a minority that perhaps are fundamentally bad. But also this idea of everyone is equal, aren't they? It's like Pablo Escobar said, everyone has his price. And so to have something like blockchain that can remove that, as you say, that can take that out of the equation, it's a hugely powerful tool.
100%. And every person, regardless of how dark and evil they are, they always do some good stuff and they always do some bad stuff. And everybody has a dark side, and it's just part of human nature. That's what makes humans so interesting, and why storytelling is so much fun, because you can always tell stories about how we overcame the circumstances and achieve great things. It'd be pretty boring if everybody was perfect and they always did the right things. There was never any challenge. It's like that's the worst narrative of all time. That's why Star Wars is failing right now in the new iterations of it. But anyway, not bitter about The Last Jedi at all. But I do believe that we are fundamentally good, but we are good only if we have a mirror that shows us our true selves. So you have to get your right habits in order. You have to have these mirrors that force us to see who we really are. And you have to have an organizational, systemic, and cultural commitment towards improvement and being better. So I do believe we can accomplish that and achieve that. It just takes time. And we have to fix our own yard before we proclaim that we can fix it for anything else. There are so many young people who are firebrands running around telling you how they're going to change the whole government. But then I remember George Peterson, he says, these very same people who do this can't even make their bed or keep a clean room. So yeah, but you're going to go and run the entire global economy and tell us what all of our human rights should be. Clean your own room, make your own bed, and find your own lobster before you tell people what lobsters they should have. So similarly, Cardano needs to build a great governance system. We have such a wonderful community. There's so many great people doing amazing things. And I think there's enough meat and potatoes there for years worth of work. And if we solve it, we have something to offer the rest of the world and to give them hope that we can do it better across our industry and then eventually across governance as a whole.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Charles, I'm conscious that we've taken up quite a lot of your time, so, which we really appreciate. Do you have a few minutes just to answer a couple of audience questions before we sign off?
100%. Ask me anything. Remember, it doesn't even have to be crypto. We can even talk about Bison.
Well, that leads me perfectly into the question I had, Charles. I think Dumpling has been looking through the comments, so perhaps after this one, she can round us off with a couple of audience questions. But yeah, Charles, tell me about these bison. Like, is this the culmination of a sort of childhood dream? Is this something that you've always yearned to do? And are you one day just going to kind of head off into the sunset and become, a full-time bison wrangler? Is that the end game here?
Well, the greatest thing about livestock is they are the ultimate grounding entity. No matter how rich, famous, brilliant, capable, sexy you happen to be, the animal still shits on you the exact same way. So they really don't care who you are, and that's nice to have something in your life that it keeps you honest. And if you don't feed them, they die. And if you want to know who a person really is, give them something to take care of that's objective. Like one of the things I do with a lot of new employees, it's an old trick I have, is I'll buy them an aero garden. So these little hydroponic gardens, and they're super cool. You plug them in, you program, and you put these little pods in. They kind of self-water, but you still have to put the water in, the plant food in, and you have to prune them. Well, you give it to them, you come back 2 months later, and half of the people just still be in the fucking box. So it tells you where they stand. But then they actually unboxed it, and they did it. Does the garden look beautiful, and is it well tended, or is the garden unkept, or are the plants dead? If the plants are dead and the garden's unkept, that basically tells you a lot about that person, their attention to detail, and their ability to take care of the things that are vulnerable that require them to take care of those things. So bison are a great personification of that. The problem is I don't have an enormous amount of free time. So if you get cattle are like the best animals in the world at killing themselves. They're just so we bred all the brains out of them, and we bred all the immune system out of them to make them as fat and delicious as possible. Bison are still roughly wild animals. They just do whatever the hell they want to do. They keep to themselves. You don't have breech pregnancies. And if you get too close to them, they basically try to kill you. So they are wild animals. And so you respect them and you keep a healthy distance and you take care of the things you take care of, but they're not a huge time commitment. I just got to feed them in the winter, but other than that, they just kind of wander around my land. I got about 54 square kilometers, and that's a huge chunk of land for them to have fun on. And this bison herd would be very comfortable with the bison herd 500 years ago. They're exactly the same. They're just a little fatter because I give them better food during the winter. But other than that, it's the same thing. But that said, they're well cared for. If you take a look at pictures of them, they're very healthy. They got thick coats, and for the most part, the herd continues to grow and thrive. So it's a good grounding effect, and it's a good reminder that glory is fleeting, and you need to be constantly reinventing yourself and self-vigilant discipline.
Yeah, and remind yourself, it's such a good reminder of that there's life beyond work, life beyond the office, and I guess, as you say, they kind of keep your feet on the ground, I guess.
Well, you should never view, one of the big tragedies in the 19th century was that we created this concept of mass manufacturing work, and people went from vocations and professions that encompass their personality and their character. I have a job. And then I go home to not job, and I'm two completely different people. Well, if you're a doctor, you never shut it off. It's not like, well, I was a surgeon, between 9 to 5, but now that you have that gunshot wound at 5:30, I'm sorry, I'm no longer a surgeon. I've turned off the surgeon part of my brain. It's another surgeon's problem. No, you're a doctor. Everywhere you go, it's who you are. You carry it with you. Well, similarly, I try in everything I do to carry the core principles of what I do in Cardano and IOG to all my other roles. So that they have a term for it, kodawari and ikigai. Kodawari is a Japanese term for the relentless pursuit of perfection. So you wake up every day and you say, I can be a little better today. Everything I do, I can make it a little better. Just like Jiro dreams of sushi. It's like every day, I can make a slightly better tuna roll, just a little bit better than the day before. And then ikigai is this kind of concept of a way of life where the things that you do are integrated into your flow of life so that you're always in a state of bliss from the things that you do. So it doesn't matter if I'm doing something with the bison or making glowing plants in a lab, or we're doing regenerative medicine work up at Gillette, 4,000 patients, by the way, or we're doing cryptocurrency work, or we're writing a paper, or, we're venture capital work, or I'm speaking at a conference. And all those things, there's a common thread that connects them, this love of exponential technologies, this love of people, this belief in the goodness of people, and this concept that there's always something to learn. And that when you go into an activity, you expect you're going to learn something from that, and it's going to make you better. And I try to find a way to incorporate that in all the things I do, so it never feels like work.
It's a great philosophy to have. Dumpling, did you have any audience questions for Charles? well.
Yeah, Charles, with everything going on in your life and Cardano, do you sleep 8 hours a day still?
No, I got an Aura ring. You'll see it on my right hand. I use it to track sleep. So on average, I get about 5.5 to 6.5 hours of sleep. The ratios are really interesting. A lot of work to try to improve the light, deep, and REM sleep ratios. It used to be like 60, 20, 20, 6% light sleep, 20% deep sleep, 20% REM sleep. But I've got to about a third, third, and third. So the REM efficiency really gone up, and the deep sleep efficiency has really gone up. That's something I'm actually quite interested in. There's several good books on this topic, but can you somehow find a way to, on 4 or 5 hours of sleep, get the same efficacy as if you slept 8 hours? And it's a challenge because I have so much work and I travel so much and I'm always jet lagged and these things that the last 10 years it's really hurt me, that lack of sleep, and it's definitely had some health consequences that I'm kind of working my way through, but I'm getting where I need to go. But I hope that's something I can crack and figure out. I actually have a lifestyle group and we're a member of the American College of Lifestyle Physicians at my clinic up in Gillette. And we look at diet, exercise, and sleep as equally important to all the allopathic interventions that people do, and the functional medicine interventions that people do. But it's good sleep environment. Try to keep your blue light levels low. Make sure that you melatonin hack so your cycles are right. There's all kinds of light therapies that you can do for that. Good sleeping environment. You wear a sleep mask. Make sure you're breathing through your nose instead of your mouth. All kinds of stuff like that to put in, and I'm experimenting with all of it. There's even some cool devices like HAPA-B, for example, that I just picked up and see if I can use PEMF to enhance and get deeper sleep.
Before I hand it back to Guy, here are some of the favorite things I learned from today's space. Number one is part of leadership is knowing when not to be in the room, and leadership has a shelf life. When it comes to governance and moving forward, the OGs might overstep, and it's for us, for everyone in the community, to remind them and to disagree with them. And finally, we need to go from the mindset of don't be evil to can't do evil. Thanks. Over to you, Guy.
Thank you, Dumpling. Yeah, Charles, I just wanted to pick up on what you were talking about regarding sleep, because it's something that I kind of obsess over a little bit as well. I never feel I get enough. Are you familiar? One theory that I've been reading about a bit recently is that actually this idea of sort of sleeping for a period, I think 8 hours is sort of seen as the benchmark. 8 hours a night is what everyone should be getting. And I've seen a lot recently about how they're starting to think that maybe that's not the case. And in actual fact, what people used to do would be to have sort of a second sleep. So you might sleep, and this is obviously informed by the fact that things like electric light weren't there to sort of keep people up after dark. But this idea that people would sleep once it got dark and then wake sort of in the around sort of midnight or in the wee hours of the morning and get up and do stuff like pray or perhaps read or get up to something with their wife or whatever it might be, and then actually go back for a second sleep. And second sleep is referenced quite a few places in literature. Is that something that you're familiar with? Have you come across that theory?
Oh yeah, polyphasic sleep cycles, and it's interesting because there's still some pseudo polyphasic cultures. For example, Spain and the whole siesta culture. You take a nap sometime in the afternoon, and then you're absolutely right. During the Middle Ages, second sleep was definitely a thing because they didn't have alarm clocks, and there's just a lot of stuff that needed to get done. So people would actually sleep in shifts. Sailors are notorious for this too. Like, for example, when we were in Papua New Guinea and on the ocean in a catamaran, we had a polyphasic sleep schedule because literally every 8 hours we'd have to get up and take the magnetic sled in and process and clean the sled. So that means you have 3 sleep cycles. So at any given time on a ship, if it's a properly run ship, there are people sleeping regardless of the time of day. So the question is, can you break 8 hours into a collection of naps? And maybe if you do that in the right way, you actually, when you sum up the time, actually get less time. The other thing is learning and retention. If you're if you're a student or you're in a high study mode, maybe it does make sense because the way the brain processes information to take naps right after studying, because it'll actually help in memory formation and retention. So I think sleep hacking is a very underappreciated thing. The problem is that we're actually doing 3 really terrible things to ourselves to hurt our sleep hygiene. One, we're all hopped up on, we're doing fuck ton of caffeine. It's in everything. And that does interfere with the melatonin cycle. And then also we have computing devices that all have screens and tons of blue light, which again interferes with this thing. And modern lifestyle really harms our ability to have a good sleep environment. Your heart rate should be below 60 beats per minute, and your brain waves need to be in a certain state for you to be able to do that. And so it's no coincidence that the number one prescribed drugs typically are related to sleep aids. When you take a look at this, like I think 20, 30 million Americans, about 10% of the population suffer from chronic insomnia. And I think more than 50 to 100 million, depending on how you want to cut that, suffer from some form of transient or mild insomnia. And Matt Whitaker wrote a wonderful book just talking about this epidemic about it. And the thing is that chronic sleep deprivation actually is as harmful to you as smoking or drinking alcohol. It's really bad. If you and the great example is if you actually take a look at shift workers, people who work the night shift versus the day shift, because it's so hard to sleep if you're a night shift worker. If you look at the health consequences over a 20, 30-year period, it can actually take more than 10 to 15 years off your life. So this is probably the single most important thing when you're building a foundation of your health to focus on, in addition to exercise and nutrition. Solving those problems, it would be the biggest health renaissance in U.S. history, and world history, frankly. But that said, there's Amazon tribes that are still polyphasic, where they keep that second sleep. There's some triphasic people, and there's actually, I think it was Steve Pavlina, way back in the day, did an experiment where he was doing 30-minute naps all the time, and over time he kind of adapted and got hyper efficient sleep, and he was only sleeping 2 to 3 hours a day. And he seemed to be okay with that. But it's a very under-researched area, and it's a shame because it's something that really needs to be integrated in a 24/7, always-on, highly globalized day.
Yeah. Well, that prompts. I can't let this conversation end, Charles, without asking you about AI, because I think that would be a huge thing to miss out. But do you think then? I mean, people talk about AI kind of liberating us in the future. Liberating us from sort of drudgery and so much of work. Do you think that we could realistically end up with that sort of scenario whereby most people actually have a lot more free time in order to explore things like that, in order to explore how to live their lives, better, more healthier, to explore things like trying to change their sleep patterns? Because I mean, so few people have time for that these days, as I think we touched on earlier.
Well, there's a few trends here that are problematic. First off, when you look at increases of productivity, typically productivity is paired with more time, more money. So as productivity goes up, you work less of the week, but you get the same lifestyle as if you were working more of the week. This was true until 1971, when we went off the gold standard and the correlation broke. So we are now actually working more and we have less money. So the way the economic system is built with inflationary monetary policy does not promote distribution of the productivity gains. And the problem with AI is it's a winner takes all system. So once you get good at it, you can reduce your staff by 90%. And all that money floats to the top, and there's no trickle down there. Sorry, Reagan. And that's a bad situation. So that's one dimension that is very problematic. Second problematic dimension is that all technology in human history has always been an intelligence augmenter. So, the farmer gets mechanization, and the farmer suddenly is 10 times or 100 times more efficient. But ultimately, the farmer is still making the decisions of what to plant, how to plant it, where to plant it. And based on those decisions, we'll either starve or thrive. Well, this is the first time with generative AI where the actual creativity, the actual underlying decision making is not done by humans and augmented by technology, but rather it's done by technology. So what ends up happening is you have like an alien intelligence where the ship falls out of the sky and it's got the anti-grav drive and the weapon systems, and you don't know how the ray gun works. You just know how to pull the trigger. And if it breaks, you have no idea how to fix it, and you don't know the consequences of it. So social credit is a great example of that in China, where they're basically creating an algorithm-driven society where the bureaucrats themselves don't even know why your score is low or high. They just know it's low or high, and they know how to react. And thus, because you don't know that, no one can tell you that, you basically have an alien in charge of society. And so the problem is, if all the big innovations that come in the 21st century are now being driven in part by LLMs, we have this great black boxification of knowledge, where we don't know where we got it, we don't know why we have it, but it's there, we rely on it, we use it, but we have no idea how to fix it, change it, or what the consequences long-term of it. So basically what happens is you have a wisdom death, where you just basically lose this meta property of understanding why things work, how they work. A great example is, in the 1950s, my grandfather bought a vacuum cleaner, and when we helped him clean out his basement in the 90s, we found that vacuum cleaner, and what blew my mind was the vacuum cleaner had an owner's manual, and the owner's manual actually showed you how to fix the vacuum cleaner. It had detailed schematics inside of it. It showed you where to get the parts from, what the parts did. And I said, wow, this must have been like a special order or something. And my grandfather told me, no, this was the expectation we had in the 1950s. Anytime you bought an appliance, you had to know how to fix the appliance. You had not only the right to do it, but there was a whole ecosystem around these repairs. Now everything is disposable. If your cell phone breaks, your computer breaks, you just throw it away, you get another one. Nobody knows how it works. It's magic box. It's just completely integrated and you can't fix it. There's no right to repair anymore. Well, that's what humans are doing. If you put it on AI, it's steroids. So it can be tremendously liberating, but the way the economic system is built, the way we value things, and also the way that technology is being used right now, I think it actually dehumanizes us and it puts us in a position where we basically have less control over the way the world works and the things work. I think we need to actually reevaluate capitalism and reevaluate the entire economic order with these new technologies. And we need to start moving to like a multi-currency system where you have currencies that are earned through different means and they're valued different means. Carbon credits are kind of an example of that, but it needs to be taken a different direction. But I haven't formulated those thoughts well enough to be able to go into depth about them. Like Balaji, I got to write a book about it. He wrote The Network State, and I think I could probably pull something together. Going back to free time, I'm just too busy right now for all these things, and we're too tactical for this stuff.
I was going to say, Charles, yeah, you've got so much going on. Maybe the book needs to wait for a while, but I, for one, will certainly be reading it when you do get around to writing it. Look, Charles, we've taken up so much of your time, and I really appreciate it. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. It could quite happily go on for several more hours, but I think we should close up here. So, Charles, thank you very much. We really appreciate this. This has been wonderful, and I hope we can pick this conversation up again in the future.
100%. We should definitely make this a regular thing. I really enjoyed myself, and thank you so much, Bullish Dumpling, for facilitating and helping pull this together. And I hope everybody got some value out of it. I certainly did.
I certainly did. Yeah, I'm going to be thinking about what some of these things that you said for weeks and weeks after this, Charles. It's fantastic. And yes, a big thank you to Dumpling for making this happen, putting in all the hard work to connect Charles with us here at Coin Bureau. Very much appreciated, Dumpling. Thank you, obviously, to Charles for all his time and insight. Thank you to everyone for listening in today. And I can only echo Charles's sentiments and say I hope you got value from it. Don't forget, if you don't, I imagine most of you follow Charles already, but he is at IOHK_Charles on Twitter, or X as we have to call it. And YouTube, he is at Charles Hoskinson Crypto as well. And Charles, I've been a big fan of your channel for a long time. There are some fantastic videos up there. Maybe you could do one on what you've learned about sleep at some point. I think that would be a fascinating one to see.
Yeah, it'd be a lot of fun. I can do it at the click. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Charles. We will be back on Tuesday. We're going to do another space then. We will be talking to a few guests. We're going to do a quick sort of market update on what's been happening in crypto over the last week or so. We'll be touching on Grayscale. We'll be touching on all this ETF business, and we'll just be doing a kind of general kind of crypto market update. Where are we? We're getting towards the end of Q3. We're into September now, so there is going to be a lot to talk about, and we have got some really great guests lined up. So I hope you'll be able to join us then. Dumpling, anything else you want to say before we end?
Thank you to everyone who joined today's space. Hope you guys join our next space Tuesday, and special thanks to people at IOG. You guys really helped us out in securing the space. So shout out to Annie, Chelsea, JJ, and of course, Tim Harrison. Thank you guys. And thank you, Guy, for hosting today's space. It's been such a treat. Let's do more of that.
That was, yeah, it was such a good conversation, wasn't it? I could listen to Charles all day long. It was fantastic. Yeah, thanks everyone. As Dumpling says, we will be back on Tuesday. So I hope you can join us then. Enjoy your weekend. See you all soon.
See you guys. Bye.
Bye.